You know what they say about family, blood is thicker than water. But what they don't tell you is that sometimes that blood can be poison. I'm Elena, and this is the story of how my own family's greed and cruelty drove me to buy a piece of cursed land that everyone said was worthless. Little did they know that worthless land would become my ultimate revenge. If you've ever been the black sheep of your family, you'll want to hear this one. Trust me, the ending will shock you. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel, like, and let me know where you're listening from in the comments. I never thought my own stepfather would laugh in my face when I mentioned wanting to buy land, especially not at his own birthday party in front of the entire family. But that's exactly what happened, and it was the moment I realized my family saw me as nothing more than their personal punching bag. My name is Elena, and I'm 28 years old. I work as a junior architect, though my family loves to remind me that it's not a real career like my half-sister Sophia's job at our stepfather's construction company, or my older brother James's law practice. See, I've always been the dreamer in the family, the one who sees potential where others see problems. My mother Margaret always said I had my head in the clouds, and maybe she was right. But sometimes those clouds hide the most beautiful views. The evening that changed everything started innocently enough. It was Richard's 58th birthday, and my mother had gone all out planning this elaborate dinner party at their McMansion. You know the type of house, all marble countertops and chandeliers, the kind of place that screams look how successful we are to anyone who walks through the door. I'd driven over after work, still wearing my slightly wrinkled blouse and carrying a bottle of wine I'd grabbed from the grocery store, feeling underdressed before I even rang the doorbell. The moment I walked in, I could feel it. That familiar tension that always seemed to follow me into family gatherings. Sophia was already there, of course, looking perfectly put together in her designer dress, holding what I'm sure was an expensive bottle of champagne. She gave me that smile, you know the one, the kind that looks sweet but feels like a knife between your shoulder blades. "Oh Elena," she said, her voice dripping with fake concern, "you look tired. Are you getting enough sleep in that little apartment of yours?" Before I could respond, my mother appeared, air-kissing my cheek while simultaneously scanning my outfit with disapproving eyes. "Elena, sweetheart, you know we're celebrating. Couldn't you have made a little more effort?" I wanted to remind her that I'd come straight from work, where I'd been putting in 10-hour days trying to prove myself at the architecture firm, but I bit my tongue. Family harmony, right? That's what James always said when I complained about these little digs. "You're being too sensitive, Elena. They're just trying to help." Richard emerged from his home office, already 3 drinks in based on the flush in his cheeks, and clapped me on the shoulder a little too hard. "There's our starving artist. Still drawing pretty pictures for a living?" Everyone laughed. Even James, who'd arrived just moments before me with his perfect wife and their perfect toddler, chuckled along. I forced a smile and handed Richard the wine, which he accepted with all the enthusiasm of someone receiving a parking ticket. Dinner was a masterclass in subtle humiliation. Every conversation seemed designed to highlight everything I lacked compared to my siblings. Sophia talked about her latest promotion and the condo she'd just finished furnishing. James shared updates about his law practice and their plans to buy a bigger house with a pool. My mother beamed at each accomplishment like they were her own personal victories. When the conversation turned to me, the tone shifted entirely. "Elena's still figuring things out," my mother would say with that patronizing smile. "Architecture is such a creative field, very unpredictable." Richard leaned back in his chair, swirling his whiskey. "You know what I always tell Sophia, stick to what makes money. These artistic pursuits are nice hobbies, but they don't pay the bills." "I actually love my work," I said quietly, trying to inject some pride into my voice. "I'm working on some really interesting commercial projects, and I've been thinking about maybe starting my own small practice someday." The silence that followed was deafening. Then Richard started chuckling, shaking his head like I'd just told the best joke he'd heard all year. "With what money?" he asked, and I felt my cheeks burn. "Elena, you can barely afford your rent. How are you going to start a business?" "Maybe Richard can get you a job answering phones at his office," my mother suggested, as if she was offering me the opportunity of a lifetime. "Something stable with benefits. I could ask my boyfriend if his dad's company needs a receptionist," Sophia added sweetly. "It's not glamorous, but it's honest work." I excused myself to help clear the dishes, mostly to escape the conversation, but I could still hear them talking about me from the kitchen. Richard was telling James about some property development deal, laughing about idiots who think they can flip land without knowing the market. There's this piece of property that's been sitting on the market for years, he was saying. 15 acres outside town that locals call cursed. Some ridiculous superstition about failed developments and accidents. Every few years, some fool thinks they can make a quick buck developing it, and every time they lose their shirt. Worthless swampland, if you ask me. Standing there with dirty dishes in my hands, listening to my family discuss my inadequacies while I cleaned up after their celebration, something inside me shifted. I found myself thinking about that cursed land. What if everyone was wrong? What if the only thing cursed about it was people's inability to see its potential? That night, after forcing myself to stay through Richard's gift opening and the obligatory family photos where I smiled until my face hurt, I drove home to my small apartment. But instead of going to bed, I opened my laptop and started researching. 15 acres of supposedly cursed land, failed developments, strange accidents. By dawn, I had a pile of county records, geological surveys, and property histories spread across my kitchen table. And for the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't felt around my family in a long time: hope. 6 months had passed since Richard's birthday party, and those late-night research sessions had become my obsession. While my family continued their pattern of casual cruelty, I was quietly becoming an expert on that 15-acre plot of supposedly cursed land. What I discovered made my heart race with possibilities they couldn't even imagine. The geological surveys told a completely different story than the local folklore. The previous development failures weren't due to supernatural forces, they were victims of poor timing and inadequate research. More importantly, I'd found something that made my hands shake when I first read county planning documents that mentioned potential highway expansion routes. That worthless swampland sat directly in the path of a proposed interstate exit. But my family's treatment of me had only gotten worse. It was like they could sense I was pulling away, and instead of asking why, they doubled down on their efforts to keep me in my place. Christmas dinner was the breaking point I should have seen coming. I'd been excited, foolishly thinking that maybe I could share my discovery with them. Maybe this time would be different. Maybe they'd see that I wasn't the family failure they'd painted me to be. I was so wrong it almost broke me. I'd been thinking about starting my own architecture practice, I announced during dessert, trying to keep my voice steady and confident. I found some really interesting opportunities, and I think I'm ready to take the leap. The familiar silence fell over the table, but this time it felt heavier, more final. Richard set down his fork and stared at me like I'd just announced I was joining the circus. With what money, Elena? You can barely afford your car payments. Stop living in fantasy land, my mother added, her voice sharp with embarrassment. This is exactly what I'm talking about. You need to be realistic about your limitations. But it was Sophia who delivered the killing blow, her voice sweet as poisoned honey. I could ask my boyfriend if his dad's company needs a receptionist. It's not glamorous, but at least it's stable. Maybe after a few years of real work experience, you could think about bigger goals. James nodded sagely, playing the role of the reasonable older brother. Be practical, Elena. Not everyone can be an entrepreneur. There's no shame in working for someone else. I felt something crack inside my chest. Here I was, sitting on information that could change everything, and they were suggesting I become a receptionist. The condescension was suffocating, but what happened next made me realize just how deep their sabotage went. 2 weeks later, I didn't get a job I'd been sure was mine. The architectural firm had seemed genuinely interested during our 3 interviews, but they'd gone with someone else at the last minute. When I ran into a former colleague at a coffee shop, she let slip something that made my blood run cold. I heard Richard Castellano called them, she said casually. Apparently he knows the owner through some construction project. He told them you weren't ready for that level of responsibility yet. My own stepfather had sabotaged my career. The man who mocked my ambitions to my face was actively working behind my back to ensure I'd never succeed. When I confronted my mother about it, she just shrugged. Richard was looking out for you. That job would have been too much pressure. You're not ready for that kind of responsibility. That's when I knew I had to act. The land purchase would require $50,000, money I didn't have. I'd already calculated that I could scrape together $30,000 by liquidating my savings and maxing out credit cards, but I needed help for the rest. Against every instinct screaming at me not to, I decided to ask my family for a loan. I prepared a presentation. Printed out the geological surveys, the county planning documents, the property histories. I practiced my pitch until I could deliver it in my sleep. This was my chance to prove I wasn't the dreamer they thought I was a strategic investor who'd found an opportunity they'd all missed. The family meeting was held in Richard's home office, surrounded by his awards and photos of successful projects. I spread my research across his mahogany desk and took a deep breath. "I want to buy the cursed land outside town," I began. "I know it sounds crazy, but hear me out. I've done months of research, and I believe this property is severely undervalued due to superstition and failed developments that had nothing to do with the land itself." I showed them the geological reports proving the land was stable. I explained the patterns in failed developments: poor timing, inadequate funding, lack of proper research. I walked them through my theory about the highway expansion, pointing to the county documents that hinted at future infrastructure development. "All I need is a $50,000 loan," I concluded. "I'll pay it back with interest within 5 years. This could be the investment opportunity of a lifetime." The laughter started with Richard, a low chuckle that grew into full-blown hysterics. Soon, my mother was giggling, then Sophia, then even James was shaking his head with a condescending smile. "Elena," Richard said, wiping tears from his eyes, "you want us to throw away $50,000 on cursed swampland? This is exactly why you'll never make it in business. You live in a fantasy world." "Honey, this is embarrassing," my mother added. "You're 28 years old, asking for handouts to buy worthless land based on conspiracy theories about highway development. Maybe if you spent less time on impossible dreams and more time on real work, you wouldn't need to come to us with schemes like this," Sophia said sweetly. "I can't support this financially irresponsible decision," James concluded, speaking like the lawyer he was. "As your brother, I have to advise against this investment." I gathered my papers with shaking hands, my face burning with humiliation and rage. "You know what?" I said, my voice barely controlled. "I have spent years being your family punching bag. Years of watching you celebrate each other while treating me like I'm worthless. You sabotage my career, mock my dreams, and now you won't even consider that I might be right about something. I'm done asking for your approval or your help." I walked out of that house knowing I'd never ask them for anything ever again. That night, I made calls to banks, researched personal loans, and calculated exactly how much debt I could take on. If I failed, at least it would be my failure, not theirs. 3 weeks later, I signed the papers for 15 acres of supposedly cursed land. The family group chat exploded with mockery when they found out. I turned off my phone and smiled. 2 years. 2 long years of silence from my family, except for the occasional social media post I'd catch glimpses of through mutual friends. Posts about my cautionary tale, whispered conversations at community events about poor Elena who bought that cursed land. I became their favorite example of what happens when you don't listen to family wisdom. Those 2 years nearly broke me financially. I was working 3 part-time jobs, freelance architectural drafting, weekend retail, and evening tutoring, just to make minimum payments on the mountain of debt I'd taken on. My tiny apartment felt even smaller with the weight of everyone's expectations for my failure pressing down on me. But I never regretted buying that land. Not once. Then, on a Tuesday morning that started like any other, my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, and I almost didn't answer. Thank God I did. "Ms. Elena Castellano? This is David Martinez from the County Planning Office. We need to discuss your property on Millfield Road." My heart stopped. This was it, either validation or the final nail in my financial coffin. "The state has approved the Interstate 95 expansion project," he continued, his voice professional but excited. "Your property sits directly in the path of the new exit ramp. We'd like to schedule a meeting to discuss acquisition terms." I had to sit down. After hanging up, I stared at my phone for 10 minutes, afraid that if I moved, I'd wake up from the most beautiful dream I'd ever had. The meeting was surreal. Government officials, highway engineers, and environmental consultants filled a conference room to discuss my worthless swampland. The geological surveys I'd studied 2 years ago were spread across their table, now stamped with official approvals. "We're prepared to offer $2.3 million for 8 acres, the lead negotiator said calmly, as if he was discussing the weather. "The remaining 7 acres will have significant commercial development value once the exit is completed. $2.3 million. I somehow managed to keep my voice steady. "I'll need time to consider this with my legal counsel." But there was no legal counsel. There was just me, sitting in my car in the parking lot afterward, hyperventilating and laughing at the same time. I'd been right. I'd been so completely, utterly right about everything. The negotiation process took 3 weeks. I hired the most aggressive attorney I could find, coincidentally, the biggest competitor to James's law firm, and we pushed for every penny. The final deal was $2.8 million for 8 acres, plus consulting fees for my input on the commercial development of the remaining land. I was worth over $4 million. The day the check cleared, I didn't call my family. I didn't post on social media. I didn't tell anyone except my attorney and my accountant. Instead, I went house hunting in Richard's exclusive neighborhood and found something that made me smile for the first time in months. A gorgeous colonial with more square footage than his McMansion, sitting on 2 acres with a view he'd always bragged about wanting. The seller accepted my cash offer immediately. It took exactly 1 week for Margaret to find out. Her real estate network was buzzing with news about the highway development, and someone had mentioned Elena Castellano as the property owner. I could practically feel the shockwaves when she connected the dots. The first call came at 9 p.m. on a Sunday. "Elena, honey, we need to talk." My mother's voice was different, nervous, almost pleading. "We heard about your success. We always believed in you, you know. We were just trying to protect you from making a mistake." I let her talk for 5 minutes, listening to her rewrite history in real time. We had always been supportive. Richard's comments were just concern for my well-being. The family was so proud of my vision and determination. "Mom," I interrupted quietly, "do you remember what you said when I asked for that loan? You called it embarrassing. You said I was living in a fantasy world." The silence stretched between us like a canyon. We didn't want you to get hurt if it didn't work out. "You weren't protecting me," I said, feeling strangely calm. "You were protecting your own sense of superiority. For 2 years, you've used my supposed failure as family entertainment. You've made jokes about my cursed land at dinner parties. Now you want to pretend you were supportive all along?" The calls didn't stop. Richard wanted to discuss family business opportunities and asked about consulting work on highway projects. Sophia submitted a resume to my newly formed development company. James offered his legal services at a family discount and suggested we let bygones be bygones. Each overture was more desperate than the last. I didn't cut them off entirely, that would have been too easy. Instead, I let them watch from the sidelines as I built the life they'd convinced me I didn't deserve. I donated $100,000 to the local community college architecture program, ensuring maximum publicity. I was featured in business magazines as the visionary investor who saw potential where others saw superstition. The final irony came 6 months later when Richard's construction company bid on a commercial development project for my remaining 7 acres. I had to excuse myself from the meeting to laugh in private when his project manager, who clearly didn't know our family connection, called him an old-school contractor who lacks vision for modern development needs. I chose a different firm. Last month, I drove past the old family house and saw a for sale sign in the yard. Apparently, Richard's business hasn't been doing well lately and they're downsizing. The irony isn't lost on me that they might end up in a house smaller than my supposedly inadequate apartment. They say the best revenge is success, but I think the best revenge is succeeding in exactly the way they said you'd fail, while they watch from the sidelines of the life they convinced you that you didn't deserve. The land was never cursed. My relationship with them was. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and feel free to share your story or opinions in the comments.